Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Carah Ong Whaley and I'm a lecturer in the Politics Department at the University of Virginia. I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of the Virginia Humanities, which is the producer of the Virginia Festival of the Book. And now we will begin our program. So welcome to American Politics, Left, Right, and Center. Just as we face ever more complex and challenging local and national problems that are inextricably linked to global ones, and challenges that require cooperation, the more divided we appear to have become. In this age of hyper-partisanship and partisan tribalism, a range of actors are using a wide variety of strategies, tactics, and technologies to evoke our emotions, especially anger or anxiety, with the goal of mobilizing or suppressing certain constituencies in political processes and institutions. In our emotional state of politics today, there's no amount of fact-checking that can matter, and possibilities for rational discourse and cooperation remain illusory. Animosity towards and fear of the opposition has grown to peak levels at the same time that trust in our political institutions, political leaders, and in the media have both declined and become removed by partisanship. Pew research has shown that there are growing gaps in the electorate as well, and that the electorate is very divided by a range of factors, including by ideology and demographic factors like race, gender, as well as by education. So we are very lucky to have three distinguished authors with us today, whose books articulate the transformations in American politics, institutions, and in the media that have contributed to our divided states of America today. We have with us Caitriona Perry, who is an award-winning Irish journalist who until January of this year was based in Washington, D.C. She traveled our country for 4 years, reporting on all aspects of American life. And In America is her first book. She has now returned to Ireland and is now the anchor of the country's most watched main evening news bulletin. So we're very lucky to have her with us today. And I think one of the most keen observations that she makes, particularly which is useful from a comparative perspective, is that our two-party system does not serve a nation that's so diverse as ours. But she also speaks to the polarized political discourse in our nation and how that has contributed to the disillusionment among many voters in this country with political leaders and political institutions, and the disconnect between the elites in this country and who set the political agenda and the lived experiences of people all across our country. We also have with us former Congressman Jason Altmire, who served 3 terms in the United States House of Representatives from 2007 to 2013, during which he was a bipartisan centrist who had 29 of his legislative initiatives signed into law, quite impressive. And he went 5.5 years without missing a single vote and introduced a bipartisan bill that gained the most congressional sponsors of any congressional bill in American history. The National Journal calculated Altmire's voting record to be at the exact midpoint of the House, the dead center. His book is a wonderful combination of deep understanding and synthesis of the political science and psychological literatures that help us to understand how we have come to this politically polarized situation in our country. He also offers very pragmatic solutions to the situation that we're in that he's going to speak about today as well. We also have with us today Nicole Hemmer, who's author of Messengers of the Right. She is an assistant professor at the UVA's Miller Center, a columnist for Vox and U.S. News and World Report, and co-founder and editor of Made by History at the Washington Post. And I have no idea how she sleeps. Really, any of these. any of our panelists, really. So if we think that we are in a unique period in American history, Nikki's book reminds us that we are not. And she really traces the roots of, and puts at the center of analysis the role that media activists, conservative media activists, have played in constructing coalitions and the tensions that has created within the Republican Party. She also reminds us of the powerful combination of both power and populism in raising, and the implications of that not only for the Republican coalition, but also for governments. So for this program, each author is going to give about 5 minutes to talk about their book and the central thesis of their research and how we can understand their research to the state of affairs that we've come to today. Then I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we're going to turn it over to an audience Q&A so that we can have plenty of discussion. We'll start with Congressman Altmire.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to be in Charlottesville, which has certainly seen the consequences of political polarization. I suspect that's why there's such a large crowd here, and thank you all for being here. In the book, I do a few things. I try to weave together different aspects of the political polarization. And the first thing I do, I talk about the psychological research into the way partisans think, how people react under different circumstances, group dynamics, cognitive bias. Will they accept information that conclusively proves that their point of view is wrong? You probably know the answer to that. The impact that they have on our electoral system is disproportionate. They vote in higher numbers, they work on campaigns, they give money to candidates, and as the Pew Research Center has shown, those are the folks that determine the outcome of our elections. So I think it's important to understand who these folks are that are on our political extremes. There's a lot of research that's been done into the way partisans think, and I go into pretty good depth on that. Then I talk about the systemic causes of polarization, the things that you hear about: gerrymandering, campaign finance, the partisan media, our closed primary system, and I go into detail on not just what the problems are, but the impact that they're having on our candidates running for office and our people who are currently serving in elected office. And I weave throughout the book anecdotes from my own career, which, as you heard, I was the centrist in Congress, rated to have the most centrist voting record in all of Congress. I had a district in western Pennsylvania that was a toss-up swing district, one of these classic purple districts that you hear. I had a mix of kind of steel town, rust belt areas you might think about in western Pennsylvania, mixed with the affluent suburban communities outside of Pittsburgh. The two sides never agreed on anything. I had to represent both communities, and I had to listen to both sides. So I tell that story throughout my book. And what you find when you research a book like this, you go into it with a certain point of view on what's causing the polarization, what's the impact, but then you get into the research and you find out it's a little bit different than you thought. So I did change my mind on some things as I was researching the book. And I think the most interesting thing about it is there's a lot of political science work that's been done, which I cover in that cognitive bias, a lot of social science research. There's a lot of work that's been done diagnosing the problem, talking about all those issues I talked about. But I don't think anyone has talked about the impact of the people actually serving in the office, how that impacts your decision making, how it impacts the way you speak to your constituents, the way you campaign, and the way you vote. And in the end, the last chapter, I offer solutions, which I'm sure we'll get into today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you also for having me. It's a real treat to be here, and thank you all for coming out this morning. As a foreign correspondent based in the US here, you arguably have a bird's eye view of just how polarized US politics are, especially if you're like me, you come from Ireland or anywhere in Western Europe where, as a public broadcaster, which I am, you have a legal obligation to be objective and balanced in your coverage of politics and elections. And then you're transferred from that into the US system, where the media is largely quite agenda-driven, with the exception, obviously, of the publicly funded ones. But the main cables and broadcast networks were very different experience for me to see. And so I travelled 43, 44 of the states, still hoping to make the magic 50 eventually, tick off the bingo card. And it was just surprising to see, when you went from state to state, how firstly diverse each state is. I think outside of the US, we view it as a country, when actually we should rather view it as a federation or as a continent, because everywhere is so different. People's opinions are so different, their racial makeup is so different, their ethnicities are so different, and so on. And so since I've been back in Ireland in the last 2 months, the question that I keep getting, even though we're obviously a year and a half nearly on from the November 2016 election, is how did Donald Trump get elected? Who were these people that voted for him? And I know that's a question that many people inside America also are still asking themselves. So largely that's what my book is about. It was about setting out who the voters were when you got off the main highways, when you got out of the campaign bus or plane. Yes, I went to plenty of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton rallies and rallies for the other candidates during the primary season as well. But it was about kind of driving the lesser travelled roads, talking to people and seeing what their motivation was and what had happened in the American political system to create this essential vacuum for someone who wasn't a traditional politician, and who said things that were offensive to so many people, but they were able to overlook that and see the good in the candidate that they wanted to be the president of their country. And I basically found 3 reasons for that. You know, and we do have to stop and pause and say, of course, Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, and when you're analysing who voted for Donald Trump, you're dealing with really, you know, that margin of 77,000 odd voters in 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that made the difference that with the Electoral College that got him into the White House. But basically, I saw a huge appetite for a backlash vote. And that people were so disillusioned with traditional politicians, with Washington, that there was a disconnect there across voters from all parties about just what mattered to them versus what politicians thought mattered to them. And we've seen the same thing happen in Ireland and in European countries as well. In our most recent general election, our parliamentary elections, we actually have a minority government now because the major parties couldn't get enough support. More people voted for independents and smaller parties for similar reasons. They just had kind of had enough. And so in that way, Donald Trump was able to appeal to people as this, you know, everyman type of guy. Even though he was born into a wealthy background, he lived in New York, people still felt in disadvantaged areas that he had their back. And that feeds into the second point, which came up time and time again, which was this concept of the loss of the American dream. And you come here as an outsider, you're struck by the positivity and the optimism of the country and the people here, and there's always hope. And things aren't great now, they'll get better, or they're not great for me, but they'll be better for my kids and for my grandkids. And that had diminished. The recession had come and gone, and on paper, you know, employment figures were back up, the economy was recovering, but it wasn't trickling down to people. And again, we had the same thing in Ireland, where, you know, the employment figures are back as it is here. A lot of those employments are zero hours contracts, they're short-term, not quality jobs, and the economy is back, but you still have statistics like in the past 10 years, 3 out of 5 people are no better off than they were 10 years ago. That's a lot of hard graft and hard slog, and for your life to have not improved. And then the third point was because Donald Trump didn't particularly stand for anything in particular, he could stand for anything. You know, so he was an a la carte candidate. If you went looking for policies on his website like you would traditionally have with any other candidate, and I'm sure, Congressman, when you were running for election, your policies on things are laid out. And because Donald Trump kept a lot of his policies quite vague in the election, people were able to pick and choose. And ultimately, a lot of voters are single-issue voters. They're voting on the economy, they're voting on jobs, they're voting on position on abortion, they're voting on promises to put a conservative judge on the Supreme Court bench. And so, you know, if I had $1 for every time I met a person who said, I don't like what Donald Trump says about women, about immigrants, about people with disabilities, the list goes on and on, but I really think he'll be a great president because I like what he says about this one thing that matters to me, and I'm prepared to take a chance on that. Again, circling back around to, I feel so let down by the traditional parties that here's a guy coming from the outside and sure, what harm, take a chance, see what happens. And so my book is really stories of people telling me why they thought all of those things. And then we get to where we are now, you know, so I would sort of argue that the election of Donald Trump was more of a symptom of the political situation in America and where we find ourselves in 2018 rather than the cause of it.
Well, I just want to add in my thanks for being here today and for everyone coming out. As someone who covered firsthand the violence in Charlottesville on August 12th, I've seen what the catastrophic consequences of our current political crisis looks like, and how dire it can actually be, and how deadly it can actually be. And so I think we can all agree that this is a crisis in need of solutions, but we can't solve crises that we don't understand. And I think that in order to understand our current political problem, we have to understand better the origins of our current media crisis. Because our media create our politics, and our politics create our media. And that's one thing that is almost impossible to ignore now, but that I think we have ignored for far too long. And when I say the origins of it, I'm not talking about when Fox News started 20 years ago, or when Rush Limbaugh had his national program start 30 years ago. By the time those very famous names appear on the scene, the shift in media values had already happened. And this is a story that goes all the way back to the 1940s and 1950s, and the origin of a really powerful idea, liberal media bias. This idea emerges in the 1950s at a time when trust in journalism was 80–90%. There was a real faith in American media. And there was a belief that if there was a bias in media, it was a conservative bias. That newspapers tended to be too Republican, that radio station owners tended to be too conservative. So this idea of liberal media bias had to be constructed, and it had to be sold. And it had real consequences when conservatives picked up this idea. And the consequence was their underlying argument that was that all media are ideological. There's no objective media. There are only media driven by ideologies. And so if you need to figure out how to trust a media source, you need to figure out what its ideology is. And if you're a conservative, you have to seek out those conservative media sources. And that's really important, because that's a very different truth claim from trust objective media. It's not saying trust us because we're factual or because we're accurate. Trust us because we're right-wing. And if you're conservative, that's the same as being right. And that's how they kind of make the argument about why it's okay to seek out, and why in fact it's necessary to seek out conservative media as the source of information about the world. That becomes part of the conservative identity very early on. To be conservative by the 1960s is to be in the habit of consuming conservative media sources, whether it's 15-minute radio programs or something like National Review or Human Events. It's in no way as powerful as conservative media would become, but it is central very early on to what it means to be a conservative in the United States. And that has a real impact on all the other media too. Because by the time you get to the 1970s, under fire for misreporting on Vietnam, you see more mainstream, objective media begin to change what it means to be objective. I mean, during the 1950s and 1960s, to be objective meant all the things it means today, right? To be fair, to be accurate, but it also meant a deference to institutions and to authorities. If somebody from the government told you something, or somebody from the military told you something, you reported that as fact. Understandably, that breaks down in the 1960s. But as objective media kind of get rid of that idea of deference to authority, they replace it with something new. And that new thing they replace it with is balance. The way we're going to demonstrate we're objective is we're not necessarily going to repeat what authority figures say. We're going to have somebody from the left and somebody from the right, and that's going to be a sign of our objectivity. It matters that that happens, because one of the big complaints about non-conservative media today is that they practice false equivalency. That's a practice that has been embedded since the 1970s. So if we're going to address these problems, we can't just address the developments of the past 10 years or the past 20 years. We have to think about this as a generational project that's had a generational impact. And I think that that also requires kind of a reckoning, because the thing about conservatives' complaint about bias in the media is that they weren't exactly wrong. I mean, in the media of the 1950s and 60s, there were a lot of voices that were considered beyond the pale. Conservatives were seen as kind of radical fringe elements. Of course, so were feminists and African American civil rights activists, union members, members of the Socialist Party. There were a lot of people who were out of bounds. So media did actually need to reform itself. But it's possible that Americans lost too much faith in mainstream media. I think that we'll talk a little bit about what the solutions to some of these problems are, but there needs to be media reform. I think that's clear after the last few years. But there also needs to be kind of a media consumer reform, right? There needs to be some responsibility on behalf of us as consumers to trust with skepticism, but to trust reporting and not just look for things that confirm what we already believe.
One of the overlaps that all three books touch on is the nature of the two-party system, right? And we tend to think of it as just being team red or team blue or team Republican, team Democrat, but really just as important as the polarization is the internal fractiousness of the parties, right? That we have, that really within those parties is an array of actors. So I wonder how you see the construction of the current coalitions and the evolution of those political coalitions, how they've come to power, and what those portend for the struggles that we're having right now in governance and for the upcoming elections this fall.
Well, I talk in the book that both parties have gone through this internal power struggle between the more extreme element, the far left and the far right, and the more mainstream elements of the party. And the way it's played out is in the Congress, in the House, the moderate voice has largely been purged from the House at this point. The 2006 and 2008 elections brought this wave of Democrats. Lots of people from districts like the district I described that I represented, more conservative-leaning Democrats. They ended up over time leaving the House, losing their re-elections. The Republicans right now are having a debate between the Freedom Caucus, the Tea Party type folks, and the more mainstream Republicans. And when Speaker Boehner or now Speaker Ryan talks about working with both sides, more often than not, they're talking about working with both sides of their own party, not just working with Democrats. And when you have people like Charlie Dent, a very thoughtful member of the Republican Party and high-standing, very active legislator, just throw his hands in the air and say, I don't want to do this anymore. There's a record number of retirements on the Republican side. Overwhelmingly, those are folks that come from that mainstream area. So both parties are having this discussion. The Democrats are having it outside of Congress with their presidential candidates. That's where that's going to play out. The Republicans are having it within the Congress. But I don't know which way it's going to go, but it appears the extremes are winning at this point, which I don't view as good for the country.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And if you look at the 2016 election, okay, we had Donald Trump on the Republican side, but who joined the party in order to run for president. And then on the Democratic side, you had Bernie Sanders, a previously independent, who joined the party a year earlier in order to contest the presidency. So you were seeing two people who weren't traditional to that party being put forward as the figureheads. Obviously Bernie wasn't the nominee in the end, but the Democrats are still dealing with the frisance there between the people who backed Bernie and the people who backed Hillary Clinton. And I think they are doing a lot of soul searching at the moment, as the Republicans are, and there's no clear answer emerging from either party at this point. And I think for that reason you may see a very strong third-party independent candidate run in 2020 and do well. We saw with Donald Trump that if you have money and you have brand recognition, name recognition, that you jump ahead of a lot of other folks in terms of trying to do well in primary campaigns. So I think there's something big, huge going on in US politics at the moment. And it's very, the question is, how do you fix it? What are the answers? And I don't think there's a short answer to that.
Right, I mean, it's fascinating, right, because Donald Trump was basically a third-party candidate who won the Republican nomination and then went on to become president. We're at a really fascinating time in party politics, not only because there's clearly some sort of reorganization going on, but when reorganizations happen in the past, I mean, one of the things I talk about in my book is that, you know, from the 30s to the 1960s, the parties had a pretty diverse range of ideologies in each of them. There were conservative Democrats, there were liberal Republicans, and then there is a fundamental reorientation that happens. They become collections of ideologies. There's a liberal Democratic Party, although less liberal than the Republican Party is conservative, but the Republican Party becomes incredibly conservative. It's not necessarily a bad thing that parties represent ideologies, but something has really changed because on the one hand, parties aren't as powerful as they used to be. They're not very good at gatekeeping. 2016 is a fairly good example of that. There are ways for candidates to get all of the things that parties used to do without relying on the RNC or the DNC, but at the same time, loyalty to party seems to be incredibly strong, especially in Congress these days. So there's a tribalism, but we don't necessarily know what the political content of that is. That's what's being scrambled right now, is like, what does it mean to be a Republican? Right now, it just means that you have an R behind your name. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're conservative in this traditional ideological sense. You could believe a whole lot of things, and they could change between Monday and Friday.
So I next want to ask, what can we do about the state of politics based on the insights that are generated from each of your experiences and also your deep research into these issues?
Yeah. Well, what surprises me about this country as an outsider is the low level of engagement, actually, the low turnout at elections. I think when you're talking about how parties fix themselves, you're actually talking about a small number of the population who actually care. And that's, you need to get more people involved at a grassroots level who will drive the direction of that party. When you're seeing what we're seeing in the last few years about people turning away from traditional politicians, why is that? And there are problems down ballot as well in local elections, school boards, governors, so on. And I think there's an amount of soul searching that actually has to go on as to why people don't care, why people don't vote. Particularly the presidential election, the rest of the world looks to this country, stays up all night through the night in different time zones to see who's going to be the president of the United States. And then when you have turnout figures that are, well below half of the electorate year after year, there's a disconnect there.
Well, I obviously think that there's a media problem here that needs to be solved. I said earlier that it was a generational problem, and I mean that. I mean, this isn't something that's going to be fixed overnight. And I think that a lot of Americans are putting a lot of faith right now in technological or regulatory solutions for a lot of our problems, but media as well. The problems of media in the 2016 election were not technology problems. They weren't regulation problems. They were social problems. They're about how we choose to consume our media, how we choose to construct our realities. And that's a difficult problem to solve. It requires the rebuilding of civil society through education, but also through a shared consensus that civil society is worth fixing. And I'm not super optimistic that this is going to change in the next 5 or 10 years, but seeing things like the March today makes me think that it's possible that we will see a broader generational change in 20 years or 30 years, a real commitment to rebuilding civil society. But just saying that it's not going to happen overnight doesn't mean that each of us doesn't have a responsibility to work on it starting today.
One of the more interesting things about the media and information technology is today we have this miraculous invention of the internet, and we have 300 channels on our television or more. And we have every book ever written, every word ever spoken literally at our fingertips. But instead of using that to seek knowledge and learn about issues and take an unbiased look at things, we're using it to reaffirm our own opinion. We decide what our position is on an issue, and then we seek out information to back up our position, to make our argument stronger. And when you have YouTube is one example. You know, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, Twitter, they all do the algorithm, of course, where when you search for things that you like, they give you more of it. If you watch a YouTube video of a 9/11 conspiracy or a moon landing conspiracy or Elvis Presley is still alive, on the right side, they'll show you more of the same. Your recommended viewing list over time changes to that's all you ever see, which gives you a certainty that you're right. And the biggest problem I found in researching how partisans think and the way our system incentivizes the extremes in our primary system is the people, this is what the data shows, the people who are the most certain of their opinion are often the people who know the least about the subject they're so confident about. And they bring that bias with them to the polls. So when I talk about solution, I get into long-term solution, like civics education. The book is filled with all these amusing examples of how ignorant the American people are of current events in our history, and you know those. We have systemic reform that is possible. An interesting idea, when you run for Speaker of the House, you should need 60% of the House rather than 50%, which means you would have to get at least some members of the other party to vote for you for Speaker. You'd have to build your coalition from the center out rather than from the fringes in. Some of our more polarizing speakers in recent history, if you look at Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi, they would have needed around 30 members of the other side to support them in order to be Speaker. Probably would not have happened, so that we would have had a more moderate speaker in both of those examples. You get into the gerrymandering, the campaign finance, there's political issues. The Supreme Court has ruled on campaign finance, makes it very difficult to do the reform that's necessary, but obviously if we could get money out of politics, it would have a huge moderating influence on what our candidates talk about and think about and vote. But the most important thing we can do, what I found through the research, and I didn't start with this, but I found this is absolutely the way that we can moderate things, is to dilute the influence of the extremes in our primary elections. Because when you are a candidate running for office and the people who control your destiny are the people on the far extreme, you're going to do what you can to appeal to them. You're going to say what they want you to say, you're going to vote the way they want you to vote, you're going to act the way they want you to act, and if you don't, you're going to lose. And you see that on both parties. So if you look at a solution like California has implemented, the top 2 open primary system, where every candidate who's on the ballot, regardless of party affiliation, Republicans, Democrats, Green, Liberals, Libertarians, Reform, they're all on the same ballot, and every registered voter, regardless of party affiliation, shows up to vote in that primary, and the top 2, regardless of party affiliation, move on to the general. Louisiana has something like that too. So sometimes in Louisiana you have 2 Republicans in the general election. Often in California you'll have 2 Democrats. But if you are a candidate running for office in that system and you're only appealing to your narrow base on the extreme, you're going to lose. You have to appeal to a much wider swath of the electorate. You have to appeal to people in the center and even people on the other side to have any chance to win. And it's worked in California. It's helped moderate their tone and it's helped moderate their legislating both in Sacramento and their congressional delegation in Washington. So if I had to pick one thing we could do today that's politically realistic, that's the answer, is to dilute the influence of the extremes in our primaries.
I forgot a very important announcement at the beginning, that this is being recorded, both for Charlottesville local television, the city's government access channel, our own TV 10, and it's also being live streamed on the city's Facebook page at Charlottesville City Hall, and it's also being taped for C-SPAN book. And it will air later. At this time, we are going to go ahead and move to a Q&A session so that we can have discussion that incorporates the audience. And because this is a recorded event, during the Q&A portion, what we'd like to ask you to do is to please raise your hand and wait for a volunteer to hand the microphone to you before speaking. We'd also like to ask you to please keep your questions short and to the point so we can incorporate as many questions as possible.
First of all, thank you, each and every one of you. This has been very helpful. Nicole, could you give several examples of the false equivalencies you're seeing in the media?
Several examples might be difficult right on the top of my head, but I think that one of the things that we see is somewhat less nowadays, but for example, during the primary season, the tendency to bring on, well, one of the things that we've seen is bringing on white supremacists to sort of counter liberals. And so you would have somebody from, say, the Southern Poverty Law Center arguing against a white supremacist. And I would argue that they represent very differently sized constituencies, and that it is a problem, just like it is to have a climate change scientist and a climate change denier one-on-one. It suggests that they have equivalent constituencies when they don't necessarily. And so that's one place where we saw it. One of the other places that we saw it was in the latter half of the general election, when you heard much less from anti-Trump Republicans and much more from pro-Trump Republicans. It was difficult for anti-Trump Republicans to actually appear on cable news panel programs. And so what would happen was you would have a pro-Trump Republican, you would have a pro-Clinton Democrat, and it disguised some of the division that continued in the party at that point. So I think things like that, but also the coverage of issues as we're putting one side against another side without necessarily fact-checking in the article itself is a big problem that some papers are doing better at addressing than others.
Jason, I'm wondering what part would a third-party movement play in a solution, and what are the obstacles that a third-party movement face now in America?
It's interesting. I get that question every time I talk about this. I purposely do not talk about third parties as being a solution, and here's why. Most people think of third parties in the context of the national presidential race. Caitriona talked about that. The problem is the institutional hurdles are you have to win a majority of the electoral college to become president. If it's not a majority and the three candidates split the vote, it goes to the House of Representatives and they pick the winner. They're unlikely in most cases to pick somebody other than who the majority party is of the House. So for an independent or third-party candidate to win the presidency, they would have to, on their own, win a majority of the electoral college, which with three strong, two-party-backed candidates and three strong candidates, it's pretty unlikely. Down ballot for the House and the Senate, the lower the level of the race, the more likely it is a third-party candidate could pull it off. Senator Sanders is an independent. There are House members that have been independents, so it can be done. But my concern, and the reason I don't talk about it in the book, is if you create a third party designed for centrists, for the moderate constituency, by definition, you're pulling those from the two major parties to create the third party, which means Republicans and Democrats then would have no incentive whatsoever to ever appeal to anyone in the center because they're not part of their party coalition. And if you don't have the critical mass to win elections and you've taken the center out of the Republicans and the Democrats, you've made the problem worse.
Thank you very much. First, just a quick comment to Nicole in terms of the equivalency. About, 5 or 6 years ago or sometime, the archetypical example was one of the TV stations wanted to have a Holocaust speaker and a Holocaust denier. Right? So if you want to see the archetypical example of false equivalency. My question is, given how you've all talked about getting people out to vote, whether it's the primaries or whatever, there's been some evidence of, if not voter suppression, making getting to the polls or voting difficult, whether it's there's only 1 or 2 polling places, or they don't have early voting, aside from whether you're eligible to, in one county I read a while ago, if you hadn't voted in the last election, they wouldn't let you vote, or something like that. How do you see that, quote, movement being altered in order to allow a broader range of voters?
I think one of the reasons why it's difficult to alter is because there are powerful incentives for disenfranchisement, which is why it's happening, right? if you can exclude people who you think are going to vote for the other parties in voting, you do that. And in the currently constructed American electorate, it's primarily Republicans who are saying we need to close down polling places in primarily African-American neighborhoods, or stop Sunday voting because that's when souls to the polls happen. That's a major democratic crisis that we're experiencing right now, a small d democratic crisis. I don't think we need necessarily mandatory voting, but one thing we do need is, if we're really committed to the American experiment, we need to make it as easy as possible for people who want to vote to be able to vote. And there's no moral argument to be made to keep people from being able to go to the polls if they want to vote.
Can I just add on to there for a second, though, please? You know, it's not just these traditional ways of voter suppression that we're seeing anymore, right? Psychographics became a household buzzword this week with the New York Times reporting of data mining from Cambridge Analytica using Facebook data. So I wonder if maybe any of you would like to address that aspect as well, the way in which the campaigns are using data analytics and information to suppress voters, not just the traditional tactics we've seen at the polls.
Well, it works both ways, certainly. There is real voter suppression that exists when a state like Wisconsin passes a voter ID law and then systemically closes the DMVs in traditionally Democratic neighborhoods. I think everybody understands what's going on there. To the data mining, and Chuck Todd has talked a lot about this as well, you have candidates now that are able to, in a very precise, precision way, identify who their voters are, and their voters typically are on the extreme. They are no longer targeting the so-called swing votes that have been perceived to have decided the outcome of elections in some districts, and they are just worried about motivating and activating their extremes to come out. And that leaves, by neglect, that leaves the people who are sort of fall-off voters from being contacted, and they don't hear quite as much. So it's sort of an indirect voter suppression, but it definitely leads to lower voter turnout.
So on the issue of polling centres and that kind of thing, I think the way to counter that is to have a standardised approach right across the United States, that these are the hours of operation, these are the days. You know, when you get into different states setting the laws, that's when you're into one party's in power. And, you know, like in Ireland, it's just the way it is. No matter where you live, these are the polling centres and these are the hours they're open, these are the acceptable forms of ID, and so on. And with the Cambridge Analytica stuff, I mean, you know, it's a very tricky one for everyone from a democratic point of view, but on one level, there's nothing new about politicians targeting voters who are susceptible to a certain type of message. This concept of data mining and the information that we all give away in spite of ourselves, you know, you can't barely buy anything in a store now, they want your email address. And if you refuse to give it, you're kind of, well, why would you not give me your email address? You know, so we all have this presence out there, and it's just made it a lot easier for political parties or activists to get at us. Essentially, before people would look at a street and go, I know that house will vote this way, and that house will vote that way, and would door knock accordingly. No point calling to number 14; they won't want to hear what we have to say. It just now means it's done in a more under the table sort of way. We're subconsciously getting emails and advertising when we go online, almost unaware of why we're getting it. But I do think people have become more and more educated about that now. And you know, if you see something and it doesn't sound right to you, that it possibly isn't right. You know, there have been study after study from the Reuters Institute and so on that people now, a majority of people are getting their news from social media and online, but actually they think only, you know, a quarter of it is accurate and factual. So people have their own filter, and I think it comes back to people being open to that message in the first place, you know.
I do think that micro-targeting is correct. It comes from the consumer or corporate side of things, and politicians have used it quite effectively. I think it's just at least worth noting that the campaign that began to perfect this technology was the Obama campaign. And when Obama was perfecting it, it was largely lauded. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind, that there are deeper roots to this, and how we perceive it often depends on what the outcomes of it are.
The technology might be changing, but those practices and desires to micro-target have actually done it, right?
Right.
Like Richard Nixon's campaign. Right? So that's what I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for bringing up that story. That was just what I was wanting to ask about, kind of a two-part question that kind of dovetails into each other. So like, the first part is just, how can we get people out of the partisan bubbles in terms of social media providing, confirmation bias, like as the Congressman was saying? And then number two, do you think that the social, I guess anyone, of course the panel can answer this, but like, does anyone think that the social media providers are going to be subject to more stringent like regulations by federal regulators, state regulators, maybe even like European regulators? Of course, I know that the EU and Brussels, they're very active with data privacy and such.
I think it's much more likely that they will face regulation from Europe, from Britain, from those places that have a stronger tradition of regulating media. It's less likely to happen in the United States, and I'm not entirely sure that regulation is going to solve these problems. Because to answer your first question, I know we've mentioned this a little already, how do you get people out of their bubbles? You have to want to get out of their bubbles, right? You can't force them to. And so then it becomes a question of civic education. It becomes a question of media literacy, but also encouraging people, like, when you read something and you find yourself nodding along, that's when you should be questioning the sources and the facts in it, and to try to just make sure that, you're not just reading it to reaffirm something that you already believe. But again, that's an education project, and it's not something that you can pass a law to make happen.
The search algorithm justifiably receives a lot of criticism in Google, Yahoo, Facebook, Twitter, and the problem with solving or finding a solution to that is, even if you give people more choice in what they're seeing, they don't choose something they disagree with. And Facebook has tried to do that, right? So that you don't just see all the things in your little silo. They'll give you other opportunities, but you don't click on it. That's the problem. And we all have experienced the blind sharing idea, where you circulate articles that you haven't read to show off your newfound knowledge. And there was a study that was done over multiple weeks, and they showed that 59% of the articles that are circulated on social media are not clicked on before they're read. Right? So again, that gets to people just being so sure that they're right, but being ignorant of the facts. There's a lot of studies that have been done on Twitter and the language that people use, and you can tell pretty clearly whether somebody is a Republican or a Democrat just based on the way they talk. And I don't mean if you say Benghazi or Obamacare, you're more likely to be a Republican. I'm just talking about the phrases that you use and the common everyday terminology and the emotion that you show. You can tell very clearly where somebody's coming from. And now we have people who say in their bios that they will proudly block anybody who is of a different opinion than them. And you have the hashtags, the MAGA on one side and the resistance on the other, and it's just become more and more polarized. But to your question, there is hope. And the hope is that on both Twitter and Facebook, you still have friends, you still have family members, you still have people that you work with, that you interact with on social media, who hopefully, at some level, occasionally express a different point of view, or express something that's newsworthy that you were unaware of. So I do think with Facebook in particular, there's still hope that if people have large networks, although they will choose to associate with their own political persuasion, in their own family networks and friend network, hopefully they'll be exposed to news. There was a study that was done going back to the early 1980s and then the 1940s, when they used to have the newsreel that would play before you watched the movie. And in the early 1980s, if you wanted to watch, and before, in the 70s and before, if you wanted to watch Wheel of Fortune at 7:30, you had to sit through either John Chancellor, Walter Cronkite, or David Brinkley to get there, because there was no remote control, and you didn't want to get off the couch, and there were So what they found in studying is there were a lot of people who were very disinterested in politics, they were disinterested in current events, but they still voted. Whereas today, if people are disinterested in politics, they can go anywhere. They can see what the Kardashian sisters are up to. They can watch March Madness. They can watch a cooking or home renovation show. Their choices are limitless. So they're not exposed to news in the same way they used to be in those previous examples, and they don't vote in the greatest numbers. So I do think with Facebook, hopefully people will gain some exposure to news that they otherwise would have missed.
And I would just add to that as well, you know, there's nothing new in the world about propaganda either. Like that's around as long as politicians are around. And it's one thing exposing people to news, but again, the surveys are there, the statistics are there, that the trust in the news media in this country in particular is extremely low. It's 38% or something like that. So that's a problem, even if you find a way to give people balanced, unbiased, objective news, they're not going to believe it anyway. And on the subject of regulation, we are, you know, in Ireland, we are home to the European and Middle East headquarters of most of the big Facebook, Googles, or Twitter, all of that. And we have, obviously, European regulations, and our Data Protection Commissioner in Ireland has taken a number of cases against various people looking for information to be handed over and protection rights. So I do think the driving force for this might come back across the Atlantic like that. But again, you know, the mainstream media is also regulated, and that doesn't mean either that it's perfect.
Thank you.
For 45 years, I worked in a business. Excuse me. For 45 years, I worked in a business that was highly involved with foreign people or people from experts from other countries. Every year there was an election, they would come to me as an American and be very concerned about the lack of people voting. And it was interesting to me that it was Ms. Perry, a foreigner, that made that comment about all of the other people. But the question is, do you see anything that will eventually come forward from this apparently youth movement right now that we have with the guns and the shooting and whatever? We have marches here, we have marches in Washington. Do you think any of that will manifest itself into those people coming up and getting into the political system, at least enough to vote?
I think one of the most positive benefits of the anxiety that the country is clearly experiencing right now politically is the political activism, hopefully on both sides. The most prevalent have been anti-Trump, the Women's March and the NRA, anti-NRA march today. But I do have hope that they've spurred a more civic-minded, young constituency, and they've spurred within people a feeling of a duty that I need to vote, I need to show up, I need to be involved in current affairs, and I need to be politically active. And we'll see if that lasts. Traditionally, young people have voted in very low numbers, and then as they get older and they get families and they buy houses and they start thinking about other things, they become more politically interested. But I think there's a change that's occurring. There's certainly a demographic change occurring in the country, and I think there's a political interest change. And the pendulum always swings back, and I would argue the pendulum has swung about as far as it can swing for just on both sides, the anxiety and the polarization that exists. And hopefully it's going to start moderating, and I hope that involves more political activism, not just from young people, but all demographics in the country.
And I think we're seeing that already. I mean, we see these marches as these big media events, but they have actually translated into actual traditional forms of political activism. There are massive voter drives among young people right now in Florida. We've seen it in the aftermath of the Women's March. The number of women who were not just looking to vote, but who are looking to run for office has multiplied by more than 10 times. Like, it's astronomical, the number of women who are seeking to get involved in traditional forms of politics. And we've seen this traditionally as well. There was a major march like this one for the moratorium against the war on Vietnam in 1969, and even though it didn't end the war in Vietnam that year, what it did was it turned those young people into political activists who fundamentally changed the Democratic Party 3 years later. So I think that there's both precedent for this, but also signs right now that this has the potential to have some lasting effects on traditional politics.
I think there does have to be change though, because if people march in the campaign and if the status quo remains, they will stop and become disillusioned like every other generation. But it's definitely heartening to see the level of activism and, as you were saying, the number of people who want to run for elections. That's really where you get that momentum building.
In contrast to the United States, Australia has mandatory voting laws. Would you care to comment on that?
I lived in Australia for a while, and I still write about American politics for Australian audiences. I think it's a powerful idea that works really well in Australia. In Australia, if you want to protest vote, you can either scratch your ballot and pay the fine, or you can just not vote for anyone on your ballot. So you can register protest that way. I think it would be almost impossible to enact that here in the United States structurally.
We don't have mandatory voting in Ireland, but I think forcing anyone to do anything is generally not a good idea, and democracy should be, you should encourage people to want to have the appreciation of your forefathers and mothers who went before you to struggle to get that right to vote. That, it's more about encouraging people to want to do that and to want to be engaged in their community to such a point that they care about who's making the decisions.
I discuss mandatory voting in the book, and I talk about Australia in the context of the people who are currently sitting at home today bringing moderating influence to the polls when they vote. So I would like to see a way to get them to the polls. Mandatory voting, as Caitriona just alluded to, is not only difficult in this country, it's probably unconstitutional. There's a debate about that, but that makes it really difficult. And it would not be politically popular, certainly among the Republicans, to bring more Democrats. But Norm Ornstein has a great idea about this, that rather than provide something where you do mandatory voting, you give people an incentive such as hold a national lottery where your vote is your ticket to the lottery, and that's incentivize people to come out. So finding a way, states can experiment with other ideas to do this, but finding a way to get more people to vote makes a difference. And if you look at Australia, the candidates who run in Australia have said specifically that the fact that they have 95% turnout changes the way they approach the electorate. They're more moderate and they're more reasonable, and they compromise more in the legislature because they're accountable to the entire voting population rather than just the extremes.
Okay, just a quick process point. I am noting when hands go up, and I have a running list. So we have a question down here.
Thank you. The Q&A is excellent. Thank you. My question is, our polarization now is terrible, but are there examples in history that you can call to mind that you've considered, and also consider the manner in which that polarization either improved, because in most instances I think it did improve, or changed?
I mean, polarization is not something that's new to the United States, nor is vulgar politics. If you look at the way that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams used to beat up on one another, it was pretty visceral. Fights would break out between Taft supporters and Roosevelt supporters in 1912. So there have definitely been times of polarization in the United States. One way in which they seem to resolve themselves is you get these breakouts of third-party candidates that begin to fundamentally change the conversation. The thing about polarization is you have two poles, and then there are people who feel unspoken for. And when you get a popular third-party candidate, be it somebody like, Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, or George Wallace in 1968, or Ross Perot in 1992 and 96, they begin to fundamentally change the parties because the parties see that there is a vote up for grabs there. And that begins to change the conversation, reorient the politics, and bring in more overlap. And it may be something that we see relatively soon, because we're seeing the rise of all of these third-party candidates who are changing fundamentally where the polls are. Right, we're seeing a breakdown in consensus of conservative foreign policy, of conservative opinion on trade. Like, everything's getting mixed up right now. And you could imagine that out of that sort of crisis, or out of that moment of change, that the polls begin to break down because they're not sustainable anymore. But history provides lessons. It doesn't necessarily provide a crystal ball for us to see what happens next.
I think it's important to remember, I argue that the nation as a whole is not nearly as polarized and politically divided as it's made out to be. Certainly Congress is, and it is because of the reasons I talked about. We incentivize the extremes in our electoral process, but most people don't wake up every day thinking about what Congress is up to or how polarized they would like to see the country. They think about what's my sports team going to do in the upcoming draft, what activity does my kid have tonight, what does my work week look like next week. We're not thinking every day what's going on in Congress and what's my congressman doing. And those are the folks that are less politically interested, and as we've talked about, they don't show up in the polls. But in Congress, we're a lot more polarized. And we have, in the nation's history, we are in Virginia right now. Certainly we remember the Civil War. That was a time when we were, I think it's fair to say, more polarized than we were, we actually took arms against each other. People would argue the 60s with the Vietnam issue and the campus protest. Certainly the early days of the Republic, we had a sitting vice president kill Alexander Hamilton, of all people, in a duel. That's pretty polarized. We had fist fights on the floor and canings on the Senate. So it's been worse. But what's different about today is it's not just us. It's everywhere in the world. Look at the European elections that have happened recently. They're very polarized, and the populism that exists is driving that among the electorate. I think a good thing about social media is it's driving people to be aware of issues, but it's also driving action. Look at the Arab Spring that occurred in 2011. There's that type of thing that's building again in the Middle East, and you're seeing it in Europe. So I think it's shaking out, right? There have been historical examples of when it's been worse, but I would caution you to think that the entire country is polarized. I have not found that, and maybe Caitriona, you could comment on that. I think most people are normal folks who, yeah, maybe they vote Republican or Democrat and usually vote that way, but they want to function in government. They want a Congress that can work together and compromise and get things done. They don't want this single party, ideologically extreme Congress that we have right now.
Yeah, and I think actually politicians have a big part to play in that. Because if all you're seeing on your news or your social media feed or whatever is the Republicans blaming the Democrats for not being able to get their policy through, and the Democrats blaming the Republicans, then that polarization is broadcast and magnified to people who, like you say, are going about their daily lives, and it feeds into this overarching thought that no politician is doing anything for anyone. I remember being in Wisconsin at one point speaking to some farmers at a farm show, and they said, oh, Washington is for fancy people. You know, they don't know anything about my life. They don't know what it's like to do a day of hard labor for 12 hours, and have to come home then and worry about how you're feeding your children and so on. And there is a polarization taking place, as we discussed earlier, right across Europe as well, and we move away from traditional politicians. But I do think I've noticed, so in the 4 years that I lived here, from the beginning to the end, there was more of a visceral hatred towards the other than I had noticed when I first arrived. The tolerance level has dropped for beliefs that other people hold and that you don't understand, but maybe you're not interested in making an effort to understand either. And that's a sort of dangerous cycle to get into.
I think one of the things to know too about the history of polarization is that polarization is actually the norm. Political polarization is the norm, and we just had this awkward period between 1952 and 1980 that wasn't as polarized at the surface. So that's actually the outlier, right?
Yeah.
In the history of American politics, anyway. And then one other comment too is we also need to think about the way that foreign affairs has played into polarization, and that oftentimes it's national security threats and national crises from threats abroad that end up bringing the parties together, because we have a superordinate goal, to use the social psychological literature, superordinate goal that brings the sides together to address together. The gentleman in the glasses back here is next, and then the gentlewoman with glasses and a blue jacket on the side is following.
Hi, thank you. If Trump during the election was complaining about the fact that the everything was rigged. And what I'm concerned about is, and what I'd like you to talk about, is the change in the attitude towards politics and to somewhat extent in business, where the whole purpose is to win, to make money or to get power. And you do this by breaking the rules and setting new rules so that we end up with minority rule of the extremists. That's exactly what Trump seems to be doing, what the American Legislative Exchange Council's been doing. And so how do you prevent this? What's the one thing you would do, for example, to what we could do to get some leverage to get people thinking about the general interest again and to prevent a takeover by extremists through subterfuge, through rigging the system?
Well, firstly, you know, I wouldn't agree that the system is rigged here. I mean, it's a different system to the one that we have in Ireland and in Europe, but it's a system that the founding fathers put in place for good reason. And, you know, if that's the way it's set up, then this is what happens. You know, Donald Trump was democratically elected, whether you like him or not, that, you know, in accordance with the Electoral College. I know there are obviously investigations going into Russian interference or interference by outside actors, but there's no evidence of anyone stuffing ballot boxes. You know, it's all suggestibility and messages online and so on. So you just have to be quite careful about, you know, what you're saying about the system in that regard. But what do you do about keeping people engaged in it? Sorry, was it the second part of your question?
I was really concerned about gerrymandering, restricting the vote, electing judges who are going to vote only on your way.
Yes.
I'm not talking about those other things, but the kind of rigging the system in the sense of getting your men in so that...
But I mean, traditionally, whichever party is in power here appoints judges to their viewpoints. You know, the Trump administration is not doing anything new there. And that is the right and entitlement of whatever party is in power in accordance with how the system is set up here. You know,
Well, gerrymandering, which you just mentioned, is anathema to the principles upon which the country was founded. Where you would, in theory, have the people choose their leaders. Now we have a system where our leaders choose their voters. I do think that the Supreme Court they're going to rule on this, and I think regardless of what the ruling is, gerrymandering in the states, courts have ruled against the ability of a partisan gerrymandering based upon legislative leaders' whims. I think it's gonna hopefully pass from the scene. As far as partisan gerrymandering, you do have to find a way to draw the lines. The people who draw the lines are always going to have a political bias, but they don't have to be the very people whose jobs depend on the way you draw those lines. It can at least be somebody else. I will refrain from giving you a long lecture on money in politics, which is what I thought about when you asked that question. But I would give you an interesting stat that will just flabbergast you. And that is that we spent about $6 billion in our federal elections in 2016. So it goes up every cycle. Of the money that we spend as a country to influence federal campaigns, approximately 40% of that money comes from people in the 0.01% income bracket. Not 1%, not 0.1%, 0.01%. So we're talking about a couple hundred people in the whole country that give about 39% of the money to federal campaigns in the country. And again, there's a Supreme Court equivalency where money equals free speech. It's unlikely to see that change. And I know the American people just kind of intrinsically think money plays a big role, and I wish it didn't. But if they really understood how prevalent it is and how much of an influence it is, if you track the votes of members of Congress, they align much more closely to the people who were their campaign donors than the constituents they were elected to represent. The amount of money and time that you spend as an elected official thinking about money and raising money just dwarfs everything else that you think about when you're in office. So if there's one thing we could do, if it was politically realistic, that would help alleviate a lot of these things we're talking about today, that would be it. But unfortunately, it's politically unrealistic.
And I would just add, because I think part of your question is what happened to this idea of selfless public service, or this idea of the public good, I do think that that has changed. I mean, politics has long been corrupt. That's nothing new. But I think that there was an era in which this idea that you gave back through public service, and that public service was a good thing to do, that running for office was, if not entirely selfless, that it was part of an obligation rather than a way of making yourself rich and enriching yourself. That idea has ebbed as a cultural value. So in the last 40 years, both parties demonizing the idea of insiders in Washington, the idea of experts, and an elite. And I'm not saying yay for the elite, but I do think that one of the things we should start thinking about is what it means when we continue to say that everybody in Washington is part of the swamp, or that we need more people who have no experience inside of Washington running things, because that doesn't seem to have worked out well over the past 40 years.
Listening to everybody, it's like, oh my God, I feel so hopeless. It's like daunting. But I do know that there are movements happening, not just with the students and other movements, but also with Better Angels. Are you familiar with Better Angels? Yeah. And Better Angels is a bipartisan national group that's bringing together people on either side to have conversations, constructive conversations. There are trained moderators here in Charlottesville, and we're looking for organizers. But do you see that these kinds of movements can have any kind of effect, positive effect, of bringing our country back to where we want it, back to the middle ground?
I think it's very helpful. There are a lot of groups, you mentioned one of them, and I encourage your work, and please continue doing what you're doing. It's just very difficult to motivate people to take that interest to the polls, especially in primaries. Most people who are not living and breathing politics every day have a tendency to sit home on the primary election day and then show up in the general elections and say, why are these my two choices? Why do I have to choose from the far left and the far right? I will say I am skeptical of some of these groups that are led by or have former members of Congress on their boards, people who were notoriously partisan when they were in Congress and now are lecturing the American people about how good it would be if everybody could just get along. And there are some folks who have written books like that who were very partisan. And, I just think that falls on deaf ears. So the types of organizations you're talking about that are citizen-led and from the grassroots up, those are the type of groups that are going to change America. So keep doing what you're doing.
And don't give up hope, because as I said, that's one of the wonderful things about this country I find, is people are so optimistic and positive, and everything starts small, and if you can make a difference in one small community, it ripples out from there.
Yeah, I think the story of the United States across its history has been the story of grassroots activists finding a way to fundamentally change the country. If you think about the obstacles faced by Black civil rights activists who were active in the 1940s and the 1950s and labored for decades without seeing very much change, and then fundamentally change the country. This has happened again and again and again in American history, and there's no reason to think that that's going to stop now. It's hard, it takes a long time, it doesn't always end up the way people want, but it's imminently possible. In fact, it's one of the longest stories of American history.
We have time for just one more question.
Yeah, my question, a lot of these have circled around education and a bit on the education of voters and so forth. And there may be more for Nicole. I recently read a book by Jonathan Haidt, who was a UVA professor now at NYU, and I actually heard Nadine Scotsman, who was the former president of UCLU, who was speaking here in town recently, mentioned there's an organization called the Heterodox Academy. And essentially, it was my understanding is what Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor liberal, and Nadine Scotsman, also professor progressive, has said is that from the 60s in the academic world, 2 out of 3 professors would be classified as to the left. Today, that's somewhere around 20 to 1. And their concern is the ability of students to engage in critical discussion and free speech, and what the effect has been on the academic community. I'm going to get the thoughts of the panel on that.
Sure. I actually don't think that students are facing many barriers to critical discussion or freedom of speech. I actually think that, by and large, I mean, universities definitely face problems on the edges, but by and large, I mean, in classrooms and in student groups, students are engaging in really fundamentally big conversations in universities. I think that's a little bit of a red herring, but I do agree that universities have changed substantially, and just like we were talking about with the media, like in the 1940s and 1950s, universities were seen as fundamentally conservative institutions, and that does change as you bring in more women and more people of color into the professorate. Things begin to change as conservatives withdraw some from the university and move into think tanks and other places. I don't know that suggestions like an affirmative action hiring program for conservative professors is the right one. Also, I mean, that's legitimately something that people raise. But I also think we need to be careful about the caricature of universities as liberal places, because academia is still incredibly hierarchical. It's still a place where, within the professorate, women and people of color often don't have their voices heard as much. So I'm all for bringing more conversation. I'm all for making sure students are hearing a wide range of views. I think that students who are never challenged in their views leave college less well prepared than students who are. But I don't know that there is a way to regulate that change. I think Jonathan disagrees, but I think it would be very difficult to regulate.
The other point as well is the affordability of American universities. The professors are one thing, but the student body is almost self-selective. Like Congressman, you were talking about donations to political parties coming from super wealthy. Some of the biggest universities in this country, yes, they have scholarship programs, but their student body are largely quite wealthy students as well. So, there's a lot feeding into that. But I would agree with Nicole in that I think universities have always been home to debate. And whether it's in the coffee shops or in the lecture halls, that's one of the great things about young people, and they have an appetite to learn and to debate.
I would agree. I'm very much in favor of diversity on college campuses in every aspect, especially in thought. I don't think it's as important whether your chemistry professor votes Republican or Democrat, but there are certainly subject matters in which you would hope that there's a diverse point of view, and whatever we can do to help encourage that would be meaningful.
Thank you all for joining us today. Please join me in applauding our